what's the difference between absolute truth and relative truth. Okay. This is also interesting. Obviously, if you're planning to do this in China, or you're planning to manage businesses in for the company that you work with, what are some of the things that can help you become more successful? And it's interesting that, I think the interesting thing is nobody checked other, which means that out of these, nobody thought there was anything else they could do to really improve their likelihood of success. And hopefully what I'm going to show you today is the other is probably more important than any of these. Okay, and we'll get to that as we move through this lecture. So I know a little bit about all of you. Before I get started, I want to let all of you know a little bit about me. Okay, so I am, as you can see, I am ethnically Chinese, but I was born in Atlanta, Georgia. So I grew up playing Little League baseball. In high school and college, I grew my hair long. I was in a heavy metal rock band in college. So very typical, what you would consider all American thinking and ideas and culture, even though I'm ethnically Chinese. Now, being ethnically Chinese and growing up in Atlanta, Georgia during that time period, you can see that I didn't look the same as everybody else. You know, I grew up playing ball, baseball, soccer, football, but I was really the only ethnically Chinese person in my school and on my team. And it wasn't until I got to Georgia Tech that I actually experienced other Asian students. So my American culture and my American background should be very similar to all of you, assuming that you were also raised in the United States. The thing where my experience may have made it, in addition to working in China for the past 20 years, is my wife, whom I met in Atlanta, Georgia. You can see we got married at the DeKalb County Courthouse. My wife is in a fourth-tier province in mainland China. Now, she was a scholar. She was at Emory University. But her values, her ideology, her mindset is still very Chinese. And when you're when your relationship is a marriage, you can really start getting into the nuances of where our value difference and where our ideological differences actually originate. And my wife speaks English, I speak Chinese, so we didn't have any language, but all of our disagreements, and we want to call them typical things, they were all value differences. And one of that I discovered is knowing how to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. Okay, I've actually trademarked this. One of the things, I meet a lot of business people, Americans, Europeans, and one of the first things they ask when they start going to China for a new assignment, they ask me, do you think I should start taking Mandarin? I said, well, it's not a bad idea. But the thing you got to keep in mind is just being able to speak the language, it takes a little bit of goodwill that you're trying to learn language, but it's more that you understand what the cultural differences are. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the cultural dichotomies to really give you an understanding, really trigger your imagination, why it's so challenging for not only our political leaders to get along with Chinese political leaders, but for us as individual leaders and individual leaders to achieve kind of sustainable winning outcome when we are doing business with people in China. Okay, so what are we not going to talk about today? We're not going to compare what is better, a socialist, authoritarian, whatever system you want to classify China as, and a Western democracy. That is not the purpose of today's discussion. We're also not going to make any predictions of the future. U.S.-China relations. What we're going to try to do is we're going to try to figure out how we can improve our relationships with the people that we engage with from China. We're not going to talk about it at a macro. And I'm going to be giving examples of Chinese behavior that everybody in America is going to think is very corrupt or unethical or just bad behavior. But the purpose is not to say anything about Chinese behavior. The purpose is really to put Chinese behavior in the proper cultural context so we know when it happens, why it happens, and then we can also, because of the cultural dichotomy, how do we prevent that type of bad behavior? All right? What are we going to do today, really? This is we're going to try to explain and analyze Chinese behavior in the proper cultural context. So you as individual decision makers in your current business or in your future business, interacting with people from China, you start to realize that there are alternative options to achieve better outcomes. A lot of Westerners and Americans, they basically have an attitude towards Chinese people that just say, well, Chinese people just cannot do certain things. For example, from an HR perspective, Chinese employees just aren't loyal. And they just have that generalization without realizing there are that they do to increase loyalty of their Chinese employees. And the huge between what they think what they can achieve and what actually can be achieved, as long as they can how to develop a mindset for China business and also develop a more healthy attitude towards Chinese culture. All right, so if we were live and we were in a classroom, I would ask everybody, what do you know what this picture is? And since we're not going to enter in the keynote section, I'm going to tell you what this picture is. Some of you may know, but this is a picture of last year, all of the corporate China MBA sponsors immediately suspending or canceling their deal with the MBA, and all marketing posters, anything related to the MBA was immediately taken down. And why was it taken down? It was because Daryl Morey, the general manager of the Houston Rockets, sent out a tweet. He sent out a tweet while the Lakers and the Nets were just about to play a preseason game in Shanghai. And basically, Daryl Morey tweeted, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." Okay, so Daryl Morey, manager of the Rockets, exercised freedom of speech, and the backlash from not just the Chinese MBA, but the Chinese government was immediate, and it was all-encompassing. He demanded Daryl Morey be fired, demanded an apology, demanded all of these things. You see that the NBA players are getting ready to play a game. All advertisements were canceled. All TV broadcasts were immediately canceled. All sponsorships of the NBA were either canceled or suspended immediately. I think some of you may remember. And then you have, well, you really put the players in a really unfair situation. Players just want to play basketball, but they all had to become spokespeople. They had to either defend Americans' right for free speech, or they had to acknowledge that Daryl Morey's free speech was somehow inappropriate. So you can see LeBron James, the most influential player in the NBA, he says, "I believe he was hated on the situation at hand," and he spoke. So many people could have been harmed, not only financially, but physically, emotionally, spiritually. So there's a lot here. We're not going to unpack it all. I don't know if felt that the players safety was in danger because they were in China during all this time. I don't know if he was thinking about the loss to his pocketbook financially because all the sponsorships were canceled. But anyway, what is the point of all this? And by the way, Hong Kong is in the news right now. Okay, China just passed a national security law that basically gives them sweeping authority to legislate what happens in China. Okay, or I'm sorry, what happens in Hong Kong. And we all know that Hong Kong has been protesting for the last whatever, and that's going to be a turning point. We're not going to talk about that, but what we want to do is we want to understand that different than when I first came to speak to this class in 2006, China was rising. It was important for us to understand what's going on in China, and if we wanted to increase our business, our global market share, we really had to think about China. Fast forward till today, 2020. And the one thing I think we can all agree on is China matters. Okay? China has become more powerful, more influential, more assertive. But China has become less democratic. Okay? Some relevant facts about China. So the United States is technically the world's largest in nominal terms, but China will soon surpass the United States. China surpassed the United States in purchasing parity terms, PPP, I think in 2015. Another relevant fact is COVID-19 originated in China. There's really no dispute about that, but the United States now has more cases and more deaths. In fact, the United States just surpassed 100,000 deaths, which is completely tragic, but that's a complete contrast to the 1.4 million people in China where they've experienced, if you believe the numbers, less than 5,000 deaths. Okay. Unfortunate thing, and this is going to impact how we do business with China, is America and China are now kind of at indirect competition for almost everything. For 5G, the whole Huawei ban, whether, U.S. pulling out of WHO, all of the different institutions that China set up to compete with the existing institutions that America set up after World War II in 1949. We even can't agree how COVID-19 originated. So we're in direct competition with China geopolitically on almost everything. Okay. But from a business standpoint, our individual standpoint, I think it's really important to where our attention is. Because one of the things that we all have to do is China stars. Okay. It almost doesn't matter what business you're in, China matters. If you're a luxury goods manufacturer, the Chinese consumer now represents the majority of luxury goods and the growth of purchase in luxury goods. So luxury goods manufacturers now not only have to know what is my China strategy, they have to think about what is my Chinese strategy. Because a lot of Chinese tourists and shoppers, they travel all over the world to buy luxury goods. So you can't just have a China strategy for China. You have to have a Chinese strategy for when the Chinese consumer is in your, New York, store, and they're considering a lot of times their first purchase of a Burberry bag or a Coach bag if you're talking an American luxury goods manufacturer. So our attention needs to be on the trends that are happening and the attitudes that the trends have not only on Chinese people, but on us. How is our attitude towards China changing, and how does that affect how we engage with them in business? So one of the things that I think is really, really important is awareness. Okay. Doing business across cultures requires empathy, understanding what other people value and what they believe. But it also requires awareness. self-awareness, cultural awareness, situational awareness. In this case, China's influence. We just showed in the example with the Daryl Morey tweet how influential China is geopolitically. Now, how do you feel about it? Do you accept China's influence and perhaps influence that is greater than the United States? Okay, you have to, that's a little bit of self-awareness. You assess how you feel China's influence, because this will subconsciously affect how you engage with Chinese people when the opportunity comes. Because some issues at the forefront of our everyday lives, and you may be forced to have a conversation about something you feel really strongly about or really passionate about. So it's important to assess how you feel about China's influence and to understand how it affects your attitude towards China and towards Chinese people. Because our subconscious biases, and even worse, our prejudices, our xenophobia, these are the things that, if we aren't aware of them, can really jeopardize our relationship with somebody from another culture. So we always want to begin with a level of awareness. All right, so let me get a little bit into a case study just to kind of put everything into perspective, what we're talking about, before we really get into the cultural dichotomies. And this study is called Lie, Cheat, and Steal. Okay, it's called Lie, Cheat, and Steal because when I went to mainland China for the first time in 2004, I had a local Chinese partner. And if you want to try to describe what he did, the only words that would make logical: $100,000 travel budget. It's quite a lot in 2004 dollars. I have no language barrier. Speak.
Gene, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you
Yes.
backtrack a little bit? We lost you for about 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Okay.
Or 15 seconds. Yeah, that's fine. We got there, but we don't know who your partner was. Somehow the screen went blank.
Okay, well, I'm going to get into the partner. So this is a case study. Now, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay,
All right.
yeah.
All right. So this case study is called Lie, Cheat, and Steal. Okay, so it's my first experience in mainland China. I've been to country in Taiwan starting in 1990, but this was my first business travel to mainland China. And so when I first started doing business in China, I wanted everybody to know I was given certain advantages to doing business in China. So I was given a $100,000 travel budget. I spoke Chinese almost as well as I spoke English. That was kind of the joke. I speak Chinese almost as well as I speak English, which means I'm 100% fluent in Mandarin Chinese. I also had an engineering degree from Georgia Tech and an MBA degree from Tech and a certificate in international management from Georgia Tech. This is what I was armed with when I started doing business in mainland China. And what happened was lie, steal. So my Chinese partner started siphoning products through the supply chain and reselling them back to our customers. He registered all of our trademarks in China with malicious intent. And he created himself as a direct competitor and started making fake labels and fake products. Okay, now keep in mind, I don't have any language barriers. I have a very low budget. I have the education from Georgia Tech. I have an engineering background. All of things not prevent this type of bad behavior, but in hindsight, I'm going to tell you how it could have been prevented. All right? So instead of calling it lie, cheat, and steal, I'm going to call it Goodwill Extraction. This is a term that I came up with. And the reason is because the currency of exchange for Chinese people is goodwill. Now, sometimes goodwill is money, but most of the time, goodwill is about something else. Okay? So When Chinese people, from our American point of view, lie, cheat, and steal, let's not call it that. Let's just call it they're extracting goodwill that they're not getting from you. All right? So why does extraction actually occur? So sometimes it occurs because Chinese people feel they won't get caught, but more importantly, they won't get punished. All right? And we'll talk about it. They also feel they deserve more, which is kind of this whole thing about whose definition of fair are we going to use? All right? Who gets to decide what's fair? So obviously, Chinese people, sometimes they will lie, steal, or they will extract goodwill when they think something isn't fair. Okay? Now, whether you think it's fair or not only is your perspective. Somebody else probably has a different point of view. One of the main reasons why goodwill extraction occurs is because you don't have real what's called guanxi relationship. So guanxi is a Chinese term that anybody doing business in China has heard of. It's really a continuous exchange of will that defines the relationship between two individuals. And in Chinese, the main way goodwill is exchanged is through the receiving of face. These people care a lot about their face, and the giving and receiving of face is what's most important in Chinese culture. Okay, so a little bit of background when you're in business in China. One of the things that you need to understand, and this is where a lot of China really misjudge China. You have to understand that Chinese people understand the value chain better than you or better than me, because it's China. Okay, they know the cracks, and they have guanxi relationships with all the participants in that value chain. So it's very easy for them to extract a little goodwill from a different part of the value chain if they feel they can't get it from you. Now, understand is when these people, China is not going to punish them. Okay, the legal system, in generally speaking, isn't going to punish them. But the main thing is society. Chinese society isn't going to punish them. There's no peer pressure in China not to get caught acting good. So just to contrast this with what's going on here in America. So everybody probably knows what happened in this picture. This is Lori Loughlin and her husband with the whole admissions cheating scandal, paying however how many dollars to get their daughters into Southern Cal. Okay. And they only recently decided to plead guilty after a year of not pleading guilty. A lot of wealthy families and celebrities were caught in the United States to get caught doing something like that, which means bribing somebody to get kids into school. It's embarrassing in America. Okay? In China, it's expected. It's not embarrassing at all. So you got to put that into context. When Chinese people do things that here in America there would be social pressure to keep secret or not get caught, there isn't that similar social pressure in China, especially when it comes to goodwill extraction. Okay, it's cultural. It's cultural in China to extract small advantages. In Chinese, it's called 占便宜. Okay, and it's especially cultural to try to extract small advantages from foreigners. Because if anybody studied Chinese, you'll know that China, the last 100 years, has basically been, use a very mild term, very unfairly by powers. Okay, foreign invaders from the British to the Japanese, every foreigner who has with China over the last hundreds has done something bad to China. So from the mentality and the Chinese mindset, if I can take advantage from foreigners who are now trying to earn money in my backyard, well, more power to you. That's kind of the background of why that happens. So what I want to do is I want to go through this case study and review how it might be preventable, this Goodwill extraction. All right, so the product is high synthetic lubricant. All right, and my responsibility or my mission was to establish the sales channels in China for both design and selling and distribution, and also to manage channel conflict. Okay, because we have multiple distributors from multiple countries who have products being manufactured in China. So this was my channel. I say meet Jack. Okay, his name wasn't Jack, and this isn't the real picture of Jack, but it's enough, because when we first met Jack to interview him for becoming our distributor, he literally could not even afford a train ticket to Shanghai. He could not even afford shoes. He was basically homeless and wearing slippers or flip-flops when we first met him. He was poor, okay? And so my Chinese partner, Jack, he was poor, he was humble, he was thankful, he was eager. He was excited for this opportunity. And the question is, why would you hire somebody like Jack? Well, during that period, the people that you could trust in China, people that you had the closest guanxi relationship with. So he was actually the brother-in-law of our Taiwan distributor. So there was a family relationship with this guy. So we figured, why not him as a distributor? Because he is somebody that we could trust. His attitude was great. He was eager, hardworking. He was always internally grateful because we were giving him so many opportunities. He was very enthusiastic. Of course, we provided him training and mentoring. We gave him his own territory. And of course, we did a lot of eating and drinking together, which is pretty traditional with Chinese culture. And we gave him a lot of support. We paid for his housing because he couldn't even afford a train ticket, so we had to rent him an apartment. We had to rent him an office. He obviously didn't have any money, so we gave him all his stock on consignment. He didn't know how to do business initially, so all of the, one of our big business was automotive. So anything that was designed in Detroit and being manufactured in China, the POs placed in China, so we just transferred the POs to him. All he had to take the order. And of course, we went on a lot of joint calls. So all the things that we were doing with my Chinese partner, Jack. Our master distributor started in Shanghai. We had another distributor in the southern part of China, basically in Shenzhen, and Jack's territory was basically what you consider in China the north. So this is what we wanted to set Jack up to do, all right? And what happened, and this is really important to pay attention to, is our priorities began to diverge. So as Jack started getting more up to speed with the business, he started running his own business, he started going on his own, he started developing his own business and his own leads. If you translate that into Chinese terms, he started developing his own connection. Okay. And what guanxi requires is an exchange of goodwill. So how did our priorities diverge? So the company, which I represented, we were trying to establish and enforce our rules and our policies, but Jack was basically trying to develop his own guanxi web of connections because it's natural. From his mind, there's no other way to be successful in business unless he can facilitate developing these guanxi relationships. And if I'm just trying to enforce policies, I'm really not paying attention to the need to develop guanxi. So let's talk about the goodwill extraction. So goodwill extraction number one, Jack siphoned and recycled products back through the supply chain. So let's paint a picture of how this works. Okay, this is very interesting. So the customer buys, we're doing synthetic lubricants. Okay, this basically means a pint of some kind of high-end synthetic lubricant that you put on connectors or steering mechanisms or electric motors. It's very expensive. It could be $2,000 to $10,000 US for a jug of lubricant. Very, very expensive stuff. All right. And once the customer has the lubricant in inventory and they need it on the production floor, they take a pail or they take a jar and it goes into production. And then when the jar is empty, it goes into disposal. What happened was jars that weren't completely empty were being sent into external repackaging. And if you took enough of these, still had 20% or 30% at the bottom, if you did this enough, you get another container of that same product. And so this is what Jack was doing. And he became a secondary supplier that would sell these repackaged products back through the supply chain, back into customer inventory. Okay, so this is what he was doing. I found this out because I spoke Chinese and I could talk to other people on the manufacturing floor, other people in purchasing, but this is one of the things that even though they're doing it, you don't really want to confront them about it because it just doesn't work that way in Chinese culture. So our response was we needed to control inventory. So we made distributor A kind of like the master distributor. So we knew exactly how needed to produce X number of forecasted parts. And that's all that we would sell. It used to be Jack could place his own orders directly and he would sell more in there and he would resign. Okay, so we took away his ability to place his own orders. We let distributor A manage all of the supply, which means we were denying his orders or his POs. So then he figured out something else to do. What he went and he registered all of our company trademarks in China. And he started telling Chinese customers that he was the only legitimate distributor in China. Now, that's your Apple. Now, somebody before Apple did, somebody registered iPhone in China to sell something that wasn't related to phones. And because Apple does so much business in China and they have so many financial resources, they're eventually able to get that trademark back. But as far as most small and medium enterprises, even most normal sized publicly traded companies, there isn't the resource to fight these trademark battles. It was fortunate for us that we had a Guanxi connection at the State Intellectual Property Office in Beijing, and we were able to contest this registration before it was approved. What happens is Chinese will register all of these trademarks, and if you don't comply with it, they get granted the trademark. And if you want to fight for it, well, it's a huge headache. All right. We were lucky. We were lucky. The third Goodwill extraction is he started making fake products with fake labels. And he started getting away with sales where he could. And along the time, he started investing in his own products and production capability. Then the problem is manufacturing high-end synthetic lubricants, it's chemistry. If you don't have the formulation, you can't get it right. So if you're selling fake products to General Motors or to Ford, what's going to happen is the recall. When something fails before the warranty period because lubrication was used in some component in the mechanism or the power steering mechanism or whatever. So this was a huge issue. And the summary is in less than 2 years, Jack had developed enough Guanxi and experience to compete with us while never acknowledging it. And of course, from our point of view, we never could directly confront him with that because culturally, if you burn the bridges in China, you're going to get probably something even worse as a response from the person who's been blacklisted. So you be very careful. Now, the question that all of you are asking is, how is this bad behavior preventable, and is it preventable? So obviously, IP protection generally is enough. You could hire IP lawyers to register everything in China. But if they want to make fake labels and fake products, that doesn't really stop anything. If you want to fight it, you still lose, okay? Because China and Chinese society as a whole, they don't make decisions based on what is right and what is legal. They make decisions based on what they think is best for society. In the case of Apple, letting Apple win with all the money they spend and all the exposure they have in China was good. So Apple got the iPhone back. But if you're a small to medium enterprise doing business in China, you're probably not worth the fight. Of course, you could try to find the right partner and not just the local partner. My comment is partners are never right or wrong. They behave according to how you behave with them. And what that means is you understand the Chinese system of guanxi relationships and the continual exchange of goodwill, then there's likely that priorities will diverge, as they did. And so what happened in hindsight? So I basically discounted every concern that Jack came to me with. I just didn't really give it enough thought. So Jack's coming to me with pricing pressures. He's basically saying, we need to reduce our prices, and this pressure is coming from procurement. But I'm thinking, well, we're kind of sole sourced, and we have a formulation that nobody else has. We need to charge a premium. So don't worry about when purchasing says they need a better price. So Jack would also say, well, you got a lot of local competitors with, and their selling can be with same part number, the same SKU. Sometimes he was talking about himself. I don't know. But that was also something that me and my Western thought, well, competitors make or produce the same thing that we have, so we don't really need to worry about competitors. And he was also getting a lot of inquiries from companies outside of his territory, and also from the companies, the Japanese companies, like these automotive companies were giving him inquiries because he was quote unquote the local Chinese distributor, but we needed to protect our Japanese distributor who was working with the Japanese customers and selling in China. So I basically had a very heavy hand in just enforcing the rules and the policies that we had in place. Really discounted the concerns that Jack had. And what that meant was I did not give enough face to Jack because I was dismissing what he thought were legitimate concerns. But more importantly, I was not giving enough face to Jack's connections. Even more important to Jack, because when trying to build his guanxi relationships with purchasing and other people in this market or in this industry, and he's not getting any reciprocity from me on just even considering how we can with that, then he has nothing to go back to his partners to say with. So I was not giving enough face to Jack. And because I discounted all of his concerns, this is the reason why Goodwill Extraction started to occur. And again, the Western American classification of Goodwill Extraction is probably lie, cheat, and steal, but Goodwill Extraction explains culturally what is happening. And if you're able to continue this exchange of goodwill and reciprocity, then you can actually prevent goodwill extraction. Okay, so get real quick into the cultural dichotomies. Normally I would stop for questions, but since we're on this call, we're just going to go straight through and we'll do Q&A at the end. These are the cultural dichotomies: truth, trust, fairness, authority, and negotiations. Now, there's many, many more, but I think the dichotomies will really help you kind of imagine why it's so difficult doing business and communicating with your counterparts in China. Let's start with trust. So most Westerners believe in absolute truth. I'm sorry, let's begin with truth. Westerners believe in absolute truth. That means it's facts are facts, and most things have literal meanings. But in Chinese culture, Chinese people think in relative truths, which is why it's so frustrating communicating with them about contentious issues, okay? Because they believe in relative truth, not absolute truth. And they communicate in a more figurative, face-saving way. Okay, so what does that mean in a practical sense? What advice do I give to you when you're doing business in China? Well, I would say this. I would say expect that Chinese people, they don't mean what they say. You want to expect that in a positive way, not a negative way. You want to adjust your mind that that's just how Chinese people communicate. They don't speak in literal terms. Okay? So, this is one of the dichotomies, just the fundamental definition of what's true and what's not true. A lot of people have written a lot about this, relative truth versus absolute truth. Okay? Now, another is trust. How do we trust somebody? So, again, I'm being very general. Americans believe a person's trustworthiness is based on whether they're fair-minded, honest, and generous. Okay? Chinese people equate a person's trustworthiness as the likelihood that they will reciprocate favors, goodwill, and give compliments, known as the giving and receiving of face. Okay, so our definition of if we can trust somebody or not is completely different. In Chinese culture, for example, nepotism is expected. Here, we may do it, but it's frowned upon. In China, it's 100% fully expected. All right? Which leads to fairness. Okay? So, how do Americans generally think fairness? Okay, so what is fair? Okay, generally it should be free from bias, from dishonesty, or from injustice or prejudice. That's kind of a general sense of what we think something is fair. It's also based on a meritocracy. So if you're smarter or you've done more, maybe you deserve a raise. I don't know. Okay, but generally this is how most Americans think what's fair. Well, let's examine how people view fair. Fair is based on two Chinese characters, gong, ping. So if you look at what these characters mean, gong means public, collectively owned, or common. You have to remember, China, based on 5,000 years of history, dating back to Confucius, is all based on kind of like this collectivism versus individualism. It's a collectivist society, so to speak. Okay, so that word in the definition of their definition of fair. Ping means equal, calm, and peaceful. Okay, so this is kind of what Chinese people at an emotional level when they think about fair. And so in practice, Chinese people think something that is collectively shared equally and harmoniously is fair. Okay, that really have anything to do with what we as Americans think is fair. So what are the practical implications of this different definition of fairness? Well, Chinese people feel foreigners aren't doing to deserve more. Okay, so every foreign manager who goes to China and has to manage local employees, they probably got a company car. They probably have a higher salary. They probably have a translator. And if their kids are in China, the company pays for the kids to go to American school, which is very expensive, and they probably have a chauffeur. Okay? When I was in China, I was given a company car, I was given a chauffeur. I was given a lot of things that Chinese people think aren't fair because they don't think we're doing more to deserve more. Now, what happens is foreigners generally perceive Chinese as selfish. because they're going to ask for things that we don't think they deserve or think they're entitled to. And what you can see is this whole what's fair and what's not fair is one of the main sources of discontent and conflict when you're negotiating with even people within your same organization in China. Okay? The next dichotomy is authority. So in Western culture, in America, we're taught to obey the law. We got to listen to what the police say, and we got to obey the law. Okay, this is what we're mostly taught since growing up in a very litigious society as America. Chinese people are taught to obey people. They're not taught to obey the law. They're taught to obey the authorities, who can selectively enforce the law based on whether you have a Guanxi connection or not. Now, we think that's corrupt, but the thing that we have to keep in mind is this is what Chinese people are taught since birth. You can't change how we're taught and what they were born and raised to believe. You have to accept it and figure out how to navigate it. All right? One of the things that a lot of Westerners fail to understand is that in China, everything is negotiable. When a lot of Americans that I've noticed go to China, they will put all their cards on the table and they say, okay, this is how we do business. These Americans love to use this word. They will say these are deal breakers. Before the negotiation even begins, Americans will say these are things we absolutely cannot accept, which is a terrible negotiation strategy for doing business in China. Americans, because they're so transparent, they're so quote unquote honest in a literal sense, they feel that they have to put all their cards on the table, just be upfront with what they can and cannot accept. They don't know how to deal with ambiguity. So that is one of the things that I always find myself advising people during negotiations is to not be so transparent. All right? And the final dichotomy is negotiations. So what we're going to talk about is the Chinese mindset for negotiations. So when we are negotiating, there's this period between when we start the negotiations and when the contract is signed. Okay? Because the purpose of negotiations is to get a deal. All right? For Westerners, this is when we negotiate up until we get the contract signed. Now, for Chinese people, the negotiations actually doesn't begin until the contract. Because for Chinese people, the contract is a starting point. And the relationship and how we're going to do business together is how we negotiate. There's a little bit of a dichotomy between what we even think negotiations is. So what happens is most Westerners, they stop negotiating once the contract is signed. They say, okay, we got it in. Everybody should know what to do. And when they stop negotiating, that's when all of the bad behavior happens. This is when Goodwill Extraction happens because we stop negotiating. If we continue to develop our Guanxi relationship, to exchange goodwill and reciprocity based on things that our Chinese counterparts value, then we can achieve a winning outcome or a win-win outcome. And we look at the purpose of negotiation. So for most Americans, it's to reach an agreement, sign a contract, to have legal protection, and to really understand what's the way. This is how we're going to do business. For Chinese, the purpose of negotiation is to develop mutual trust based on a system of goodwill and reciprocity. And so when you're engaging with people in China, the question that you really have to ask is, well, how do you align when you're negotiating, when you're starting from such fundamentally opposing kind of objectives? Right? And how do you develop a winning approach to do business in China when the basic definition of truth, trust, fairness, authority, and negotiations is completely different? Okay, well, the answer is you have to make a mindset adjustment. You have to develop self-awareness, cultural awareness, and empathy. And you have to solve what I call your China leadership dilemmas. Now, I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce to you that I'm currently writing a book based on all of my experience, and the title of the book is called The China Leadership Dilemma. I'm going to give you a little bit of information. I'm actually crowdfunding this book, so I hope everybody can pre-order a copy. We'll talk about this at the end. But a China leadership dilemma is basically analogous to the innovator's dilemma. So Innovator's Dilemma, book written by Harvard professor Clayton Christensen in 1996. And it basically describes why large successful technology companies fail. And they fail because they can't react fast enough to disruptive technologies by small and more nimble startups. But it basically is saying that to the large companies like Motorola or IBM, what has made you successful when the next wave of disruptive technology comes on board? Going to be failure because you want to continue milking your cash cow instead of innovating. This is what a leadership dilemma is. When you as American, when me as an American, when I first went to China, I was armed with language skills. I was armed with previous engineering experience. I'm with a degree and a certificate of international management. And I thought I knew how to do business. But the reason why Goodwill Extraction occurred is because I didn't have a mind China business. And I experienced all of these unexpected disappointments. Okay, really quickly. This is a summary. I've given all the slides to Dr. McIntyre, so everybody will be receiving a copy of this. When you think about political correctness here in the U.S., there's certain words you shouldn't say in public. There's certain symbols that you can't use. For whatever reason, it's just not politically correct. And if you do, it's socially unacceptable in most places, especially publicly, especially in business. It's important for us to understand Chinese politicalism if we want to do business in China. So these are some of the main ones. Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tiananmen Square, what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, Tibet and the Dalai Lama. Okay, Sun Yun is a performing arts group that is very anti-China. So they present this performing arts Chinese culture group, and then they come out and they talk about the unfairness of the authoritarian regime in China. Anastasia Lin, Google her. She was Miss World in 2015. She started talking about human rights. She's an actress. Some of the films she played dealt with human rights issues in China, and she was banned from attending the Miss World pageant in Hong Kong. She was banned, and now she's become a human rights advocate. So you have to be very careful when you talk about any of these issues. It's Chinese politicalness. It doesn't matter what you feel about the Chinese authoritarianism. If you're going to do business in China, just respect Chinese political correctness, just as you would expect people to respect those same level of political correctness when they're here in America. There's certain things that you shouldn't say here, and we expect everybody to know them. Same thing when you go to China. Now, a couple finals. China, land of contradictions. If you start doing in China, you'll find a lot of the things that I say are true, and a lot of things that I say on the surface seem completely untrue. This is a mindset adjustment because Western logic is more linear and China reasoning is more circular. What you're going to experience is a lot of things seem like they're contradictions to what you were taught or what you have learned. So just expect that. Another thing is you have to understand the honeymoon period. It's very cultural. I know one of you have traveled to China a lot. I may ask you to share your experience. But when you go to China, expect to be treated like you're on your honeymoon. That means everything that you need will be taken care of. Everything that you say will be praised, and they'll love you, and they'll laugh at your jokes, and they'll agree with everything. And they're going to ask you what you need, and they're going to anticipate everything you say, and every thing that you get serious with as far as strategically, this is what we want to do, everybody's going to just agree and nod their head. This is the honeymoon period. This is customary because Chinese people are accustomed culturally to giving you face, especially as a foreigner. Okay, so the problem most foreigners fail to realize is that the honeymoon period ends if you stay in China long enough. But it doesn't end abruptly where they say, okay, we're not going to be treating you good anymore. It ends because people realize that, well, you're not somebody who's a guanxi relationship, not really somebody who understands China business. So what you get is a lot of lip service. They will nod in agreement, and behind their back, they still have to figure out their Chinese way to get things done. And they don't want to tell you about it because they don't think you'll agree with their methods. And the accumulation of that mistrust leads to a China leadership dilemma, which is you think everything is rosy, and then something pops up on your desk, and then you start thinking, well, how did this happen? Okay. Be very aware of the honeymoon period. The last slide is what advice I can give you because I have limited time. You can't talk about how to do business in China in 90 minutes. I can only give you a high-level overview to trigger your imagination and hopefully ask more questions and we'll have more engagement. But the advice that I'll give you is if any of you have watched the movie Doctor Strange. Dr. Strange was a brilliant neurosurgeon. He wanted to go to Nepal to learn the mystic arts to heal his hands. And he was really intelligent in photographic memory and gave him a piece of advice before he was first allowed into the sanctum to meet the Ancient One. He said this, might I give you some advice? Forget everything you think you know. It's the same advice give all of you newbies. Most of you have business in China for a lot. I mean, only one of you has had moderate experience in China. Forget everything you know when you go to China. Because if your preconceived notions of how the world works, what's the appropriate values that people should have, and you take that into China, well, it's going to lead to a China leadership dilemma. So if you connect with me either through LinkedIn or on my website, you can still get to this. I am crowdfunding a book called The China Leadership Dilemma. My goal goes beyond trying to find a publisher. I really believe that the negative rhetoric America and China is leading the world to a dangerous place. And while I have no influence on geopolitical affairs or politics, what I can do is help Americans and Westerners think differently about their counterparts and develop a different attitude, different mindset, and a different approach to be able to engage with them, to develop real trust, real guanxi relationships, and mutually beneficial business relationships. Okay, so I hope everybody will support me and pre-order a copy of this book. My website is at the bottom at www.emechina.us. And that is the presentation. I think we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing.
I would suggest that. Gene,
Dr. McIntyre, I think you're muted. I cannot hear you.
Oh, am I muted?
We hear you, Professor.
I'm sorry?
We can hear you, John.
We can hear you.
Okay, I don't think I am muted, Gene. Can you hear me?
If you can hear us, Gene, signify by giving us a thumbs up.
Oh, there we go. Hear you guys out.
Okay. Gene, I was suggesting, at least at first, that I read some of the questions that have been sent to the chat room. So let me proceed with what I have received. And you can answer the questions raised by Joe Fletcher. What types of negotiations, can you hear? What type of negotiations occur post-contract? Can you provide some examples? That is to say, after you've reached a Western after you've reached a Western understanding and signed a contract, what negotiations are necessary to implement the contract from a Chinese perspective?
Well, that's an excellent question. So, if you want to think about it in those linear terms, before the contract is signed and after the contract is signed, the answer to the question is after the contract is signed, nothing should change. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that when you're meeting a potential partner for the very first time and you're trying to structure a deal, you're doing a lot of things to try to quote unquote gain that trust and build that relationship. You're probably going out to a lot of dinners and you're getting to know each other in the evening, and you're just exchanging a lot of information and you're trying to put your best face forward. The answer to the question is nothing should change after the contract is signed if you want to prevent goodwill extraction.
Yes,
Because
but you cannot. Yes, but goodwill extraction will occur. So how do you deal with it?
well, goodwill extraction doesn't have to occur. And the reason that goodwill extraction does occur is because most foreign companies doing business in China stop negotiating. And we're using negotiating as kind of like describing what happens before the contract is signed. All of this extra attention, all of this, trying to say nice things to each other and build that relationship and get people to trust you. That needs to continue because Chinese goodwill is for Chinese people is like currency. It's like a bank account. Okay. And whenever they give you goodwill, for example, they offer you something, they take you to the airport, on the weekend, you're in China, you don't know what to do, they take you on a trip. If your wife is with you on China, they send somebody to take your wife on a shopping tour. That's all goodwill that they're giving you. Okay. And if you don't understand the nature of this exchange of goodwill and reciprocity, then you're going to have a goodwill account deficit in your goodwill bank account. And what happens is the way to maintain a relationship in China, a guanxi relationship in China, is not to give too much and it's not to receive too much. It's to keep your goodwill exchange account in balance with multiple transactions. Okay. And when you're not exchanging that goodwill and you don't have that guanxi relationship, then, well, what happens is Chinese people start looking for their goodwill somewhere else. To them, they're not doing anything bad. To you, they're doing something, lie, cheat, and steal. And the thing that most Americans and Westerners fail to realize is that goodwill isn't about money. Sometimes you can give goodwill with a red packet, which does contain money, but Chinese people value their face much more than they value money, which is another reason why, from the Western point of view, China is a land of contradictions. Because based on the limited English language skills that Chinese people have, sometimes the only thing they know how to talk about is, can I get a raise or can I get a bonus or something like that. And you think that, well, Chinese people seem to only care about money, especially with human resources. Well, they changed jobs with no loyalty. They got 10% more in their salary and they quit. No loyalty. Right. But
Yeah, given the importance of face saving, how hard should you push in a negotiation if you feel that the other party is not being fair in your sense of fair, the Western sense? Should you be confrontational or should you really keep quiet and try and extract some goodwill in the process?
well, there's a couple keys to negotiations in China. One is you want to be very consistent. Okay, so you can't have any type of double standards. Okay, so for example, if your American distributor gets certain support, benefits, whatever, you got to make sure you give the same to your China distributor. Okay. The other thing you have to keep in mind with negotiations in China, and I do a whole lecture about negotiations in China, is that our experience when we're negotiating with people in China, to address Dr. McIntyre, what you just asked, is how should you push? Well, what most Americans actually experience when they're negotiating with people in China is they experience that Chinese people are non-committal, which means they don't seem to want to commit to anything. They neither say yes or neither say no. It doesn't matter how much we give them. It doesn't ever seem to be enough. And it's almost like the art of war.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the art of war. It means that the more information you give the other side, you're competitors or combatants when you're in the negotiations. Okay, so in the art of war, this is where Americans always lose because they want to put all their cards on the table. And you have to think about it this way. Every time you provide information to somebody in China, you're giving them something valuable. Okay. We as Americans think we need to give as much information as we can so they understand how to do business with us. But what we fail to understand is when we just give more information, well, the Chinese person is really saying, well, gee, I don't need to give any information to get this information, so I'll just continue to be non-committal.
Okay, I have two questions that I want to raise in connection with what you just said. First, could you clarify what the art of war by Sun Tzu is? And second, could you say a few words about what is often known as the pregnant silence in negotiation, the art of the ma? That is to say, being confronted with a poker face and a period of really where there is no response but silence in the room in a negotiation in which both parties are on opposite side of the table.
Yeah, so the art of war is obviously an ancient treatise that basically a lot of the concepts of the art of war have been translated into art of war for business, art of war for negotiations. It's just strategically, how do you win any kind of competitive situation? And the thing that you described, Dr. McIntyre, the silence. So what happens is savvy negotiators in the Asian or Chinese cultural context will know when you open your mouth, it creates a disadvantage. Okay.
Yes.
Strength is in silence. Okay. Most Americans and most Westerners cannot resist the urge to speak,
Of course not.
which puts them in a disadvantage. So sometimes people need advice. It's really hard to give advice because it's so nuanced. But if you're negotiating with Chinese people, my one piece of advice, especially when Chinese people are non-committal and you're getting the situation, Dr. McNair, you talked about, they can't seem to get them to agree. Do you want to push harder? My one piece of advice is you have to learn how to be deliberately vague. I'm going to say that again, deliberately vague. Okay. The only way to extract information from Chinese people is to be vague and force them to clarify.
Yeah.
Force them to ask questions. Force them to articulate where they stand. Because most of the time, Americans are so aggressive that they're answering the questions for the people. They ask the questions and they answer the questions. They say, what do you think about this? And before they answer, they say, well, our partner in Thailand thought this was an incredible deal. And they thought this was great. So it's almost like we're asking the question and we're answering the question. We're having a conversation with ourselves, which just puts in a negotiations, it puts you in a complete disadvantage. And as far as the art of war, the Chinese people don't even need to do anything. The art of war basically says, if somebody wants to keep on talking, let them keep on talking. I think the actual quote is, if the fool wants to keep on talking, let them keep on talking.
Yes.
So that's what happens.
I have a question from Julia. What are Chinese people's interpretation of American business norms?
So this is an excellent question. And let me tell you why it's an excellent question. Because understanding Chinese perceptions of American business norms is to understand the current attitude of Chinese people. And it's a trend. So 15 years ago, when I first started doing business in China, every Chinese person wanted to learn Western best practices. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Western management systems. Western this, Western this. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, it was Western technology. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it was Western management systems. You know, the balanced scorecard, Six Sigma, all of these things. Chinese people just thought, well, we really need to learn these management systems. Today, the attitude is, well, you foolish foreigners, silly foreigners, who don't speak the language, who don't understand the culture, who don't really understand how to get things done in China. You need to learn how China business works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that is a trend, and it's generational. Okay. So the younger people, the recent college grads, the 20-year-olds, if you're selling to teenagers, none of them remember the time when China wasn't strong and China wasn't the number 2 or number 1 economy in the world. They don't remember that time when China was weak and they depended on technology and know-how from Western countries. They don't remember that time. Now, if you're 40 years and over, you probably still lean more towards, you know, greater respect for Western know-how. But if you're 40 years and under, that attitude is completely changed. So you have to be aware of these demographic attitude differences when you're dealing with Chinese people.
You made a point that struck me as very much on target. The fact that there is still a memory among young generations of Chinese, particularly university educated, for the Boxer Rebellion, the Opium Wars of the 19th century. And of course, hard to talk about the Japanese occupation of China in the 1930s and early 40s. In other words, it can be very touchy to be a Westerner, would you say?
It can be. The thing that, you know, Chinese people are smart. Chinese people are much smarter than most foreigners give them credit for. What you have to keep in mind is, I don't remember who said this, but it generally says that history is written by the victors of war, which means the history that we know, modern history of the last 100 years, is written by our historians because we were victorious in World War I and World War II. Okay. Mm-hmm. For much of the time after World War II to about 1980, I mean, this whole 30-year period, China was closed, mm-hmm. which means that China had their own version of history. And every Chinese person who went through the Chinese school curriculum was indoctrinated with that version of history. And it's not far-fetched to say that the Chinese curriculum is more similar to the North Korean curriculum than it is to the American curriculum. Okay.
Was then or still is?
Well, more so. Chinese education is getting, one of the things that I said at the beginning is China is getting less democratic. As they become more prosperous, they're becoming less democratic. I remember when I was in China, when I was in China 3 years ago, I was teaching at the local university. And the curriculum to the international students included socialism, it included Marxism. It's in the curriculum. Now you can imagine that was for international students studying in China. So you can imagine the curriculum for Chinese students studying
Yeah.
in China.
Do we have anything to learn from China in terms of management best practices? We in the West, in particular in the United States, in terms of marketing, in terms of operations management, in terms of supply chain, in terms of logistics.
I think the answer to that is we have to learn from the Chinese, because China now represents the largest travel market, consumer market, luxury goods market, automobile market, mobile device market. All of the competing leading technologies, AI, big data, self-driving cars, and all of these things, China is leading.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but there's another thing that China leads, is it's in this whole digital economy. China was using cashless payment long before Apple Pay came. Okay, even 5 years ago in China, I paid for everything through my WeChat app. All my money was stored in my WeChat account. When I hired people, I hired interns to run my marketing events when I was in China. I paid them through WeChat. So a lot of this, China's well ahead of America. And even though technically America invented all of these things, internet technologies, social media, search engine, with Yahoo and with Facebook, YouTube, technically America innovated on this. But because China runs their country the way they want to run their country, well, they just blocked Google search. They blocked YouTube. They blocked Instagram. They blocked Facebook. And they came up with their own version. And then what happened is their own version has so many users and so many people trying to attract those users that they are innovating way beyond kind of the fastest growing social media app is now TikTok. TikTok is based on something that originated in China, right? And Facebook and WhatsApp, they're basically copying the features of WeChat because China is innovating so much faster in these areas. Just because of
yes. I have another question coming in from Sydney. Do you think that the lessening of democracy, the reduction of democratic norms and practices in China will stifle innovation? Can you have an innovatory country, state-of-the-art innovations in a country that is authoritarian and somewhat repressive of its people?
Well, I think that depends on what your definition of innovation is. The general consensus is it stifles that revolutionary innovation. For example, inventing blockchain, inventing the internet, right? But let me tell you what it doesn't stop. In practical business terms, it doesn't stop continuous incremental innovation.
Yeah.
And this is where, from a business standpoint, Chinese are out competing most of their Western counterparts, especially in China. That's the best way that I can answer that question. It stifles some of that basic fundamental kind of breakthrough, like, gene editing. China probably isn't going to come up with the next equivalent to gene editing, but because they have fewer ethical restrictions, they're going to take gene editing and innovate on top of that much faster than what the West can do with all of our ethical restrictions and guidelines.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is. And this is kind of one of the things is that our system of openness and fairness and democracy means a closed system like China can really exploit and take advantage of our system
Yeah.
because we're open, right? Going the other way, we're not allowed to do that unless China needs us.
Well, I don't want to go into
That,
geopolitics, but that prompts me to ask the question, will the Trump administration's export controls and intellectual property measures that have been taken recently, for example, I just read a minute ago that Chinese engineering students will not be given visas in the United States if they have had any background served in the military or any connection to the military in China.
yeah, what's the question?
Now, the question is there anything we can do to sort of ensure that there is fair-mindedness in the exploitation of an open system?
It's really hard.
I know.
It's really hard.
It's a tough question I asked, but yeah.
I mean, that's obviously a political question, but
It is. You don't have to answer by any means, but it's.
well, it's just, I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. So emotionally, I don't like most of the things that the Chinese government is sponsoring.
Yeah.
Okay. But what I feel at an emotional level from a business standpoint is neither here nor there. It's none of Chinese people themselves aren't to blame. And this is where you have to really develop this self-awareness. You kind of have to develop this level of emotional intelligence where you can have your judgment about the country and its socialist authoritarian system, and then you can disconnect yourself when you're engaging with the individual.
Okay.
And that's the challenge. And the book that I'm writing, The China Leadership Dilemma, breaks out those nuances where it describes the bad behavior, lie, cheat, and steal like I did today in the case study.
Yeah.
But it doesn't put the blame on the Chinese person.
Yeah.
And for people who have an open mind, who really want to be successful doing business in China, what they gradually realize is that there is another option that their traditional minds weren't even aware of. And that's the China leadership dilemma.
Yeah.
They didn't even realize there was another choice. Most people who have been, let's just say, wronged enough in China, they just assume that Chinese people are a certain way. And what they never do is they fail to look inside. That the way that Chinese people behave is a reflection of how you treat them.
Yes.
Your attitude. It's a reflection. It's like looking in the mirror. If you treat that person on the other side with skepticism, mistrust, and you need to put all these rules in the contract to protect them from bad behavior, well, that probably increases the likelihood of bad behavior.
Yeah. I have one last question. How did you resolve the matter with Jack in the case study, the real life case study? What happened to Jack?
Well, unfortunately, I had left that position before it was resolved. I was there up until, the registration, the siphoning of products through the supply chain. And we knew that he was doing his own manufacturing. And, the interesting thing is he was trying to get the formulations from me because I had all the formulations on my hard drive.
Yeah.
And if I was unethical, I probably could have easily sold those formulations for $500,000, I would say.
Yeah.
But what I did was I followed company protocol. I deleted those formulations off my drive and never even entertained the thought of giving him the formulations.
Yeah. A good outcome.
But the answer, the
Yes,
answer
go
to the
ahead.
question I just want to say is that the mistake that I made with Jack is I was too specific in what he could and could not do, and I was too specific in what we could or could not do. This is where I teach myself, when you get asked questions where you know the answer is no, the advice is to be deliberately vague, because it's never going to they're never going to push you to say, oh, I need an answer. Is it yes or no? Now I need an answer. It's never going to come to that. Culturally, it never reaches that. So you can be deliberately vague forever and
Yeah.
never have to address that hard question to address.
Sounds like academia. Are there any other questions from the class? We're at 9:10 p.m. Are there any other questions from the class? Caitlin, Calder, Corey, Danielle, Jeffrey, Jeremy, Joe? Any questions you want to raise? No. Well, we're going to thank you very much. We have recorded this, so I'll try and send you a recording of it. Appreciate your
Okay.
time and your insight and your deep knowledge of doing business in China. Wish you luck on the book. I'll definitely be buying one in advance, of course. And
Yes.
you have exchanged. Did you give the students your email? I think you have the
You can
website.
give them the email. When you give them the slides,
Yes.
my website is on the last slide.
Okay.
So, for anybody who's doing business in China, one of the things that I'm offering for, if you pre-order multiple copies, is I'm offering a lot of bonuses that include training, advisory services, and
Yeah,
even
of
having
course.
me for an
Yeah.
entire year as a business advisor.
Yeah.
So,
When is your next trip to China? I guess with COVID-19, you're sort of stuck in Irvine, California.
yeah, I haven't been to China for a while, but it's all about your attention.
Yeah.
So my attention is on China. So in all the groups and all the news and all the LinkedIn posts and social media posts. So I keep up with the attitudes and I
Yeah.
can see the trends. And
Okay.
that's really why I'm able to offer the type of guidance and advice I am, is because it's the experience combined with where my attention is, and
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
in other people.
Very good. Let me see. I'm looking at the chat room here.
I
So
welcome any of the students to email me directly. I also welcome everybody to connect with me on LinkedIn.
yes.
I will just send you an email, with my LinkedIn. I mean, you could probably find me, and you could also find me from my website. Yeah, and I have a
Yeah.
meetup group. We do virtual meetups. We talk about China.
Okay.
So if anybody's interested in this topic, just feel free to stay in touch.
Well, you're invited to visit with us in Atlanta when travel is okay. Anytime. We'll organize a wider opportunity for you to talk to a larger group of people than the class here this summer, my particular class. Thank you very much.
All right.
I'm
Thank you,
appreciative.
everybody.
Yes. Thank you so much. Have a great
Thank you.
afternoon, evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care,
Thank you.
everybody.
We're going to
All right.
disconnect and end the call. Bye, Gene.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Take care.